There is a difference between finding something abandoned and finding something set down. Abandoned things show damage. They reveal haste, the weight of a moment when survival takes precedence over everything else. But the tent we found on the north shore of Brule Lake looked like someone had spent an hour making sure everything was in order. The sleeping bag was rolled and strapped. The dry bags were sealed and sorted by color. A water filter was placed in a Ziploc beside a cook stove that had been wiped clean. Even the boots were inside, set neatly beside the sleeping pad with the laces tucked in. Whoever left that tent did not run from anything. They unzipped the door from the inside, stepped out barefoot into an October forest in northern Minnesota, and walked away from every single thing they had carried in. That is the part I keep coming back to. Not what we heard that night on the water. Not what I saw standing in the shallows 2 days later. The boots. The fact that someone took the time to arrange them, the same way you would set your shoes by the door before bed, and then walked out onto frozen ground without them. I need to go back to the beginning. The four of us had been doing a trip like this every year since college. Marcus, Shelby, Danny, and me. Not the same place every time, but always somewhere remote. Always somewhere that required effort to reach. We had done the Adirondacks, a long stretch of the Buffalo River in Arkansas, a week on Isle Royale. The trips were the only tradition from school that survived into our 30s intact. Jobs changed, people moved, relationships started and ended, but every October the four of us carved out 5 days and went somewhere that made cell phones useless. It was the 1 week a year when nobody could reach us, and we could stop pretending that constant availability was a reasonable way to live. This year Marcus picked the Boundary Waters. None of us had been. He had been researching it for months, sending links to our group chat that nobody responded to but everyone read. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is over 1 million acres of lakes and boreal forest in the far north of Minnesota, pressed right against the Canadian border. No motors allowed, no roads once you pass the entry points, no cell service, no structures. You paddle in, you portage between lakes carrying everything on your back, and for however many days your permit covers, you are genuinely unreachable. Marcus said it was the most isolated paddling you could do in the lower 48, and after being there, I can confirm he was not exaggerating. There is a point during the second or third portage where you look around and realize that the nearest paved road is a full day of hard travel away. The nearest hospital is further. If something goes wrong, you handle it yourself or you do not handle it at all. We launched from the Sawbill Lake entry point on a Monday morning in early October. The plan was 5 days, 4 nights, a wide loop through a chain of lesser trafficked lakes before circling back to the truck. October is late for the Boundary Waters. Most people go in summer when the days are long and the bugs are manageable. By October, the leaves have dropped. The nights fall into the 20s. And you can paddle an entire day without seeing another group. Marcus liked it that way. He said the wilderness does not start until you feel the absence of alternatives. At the time, I thought that was just Marcus being dramatic. I do not think that anymore. The first 2 days were everything you hope for on a trip like this. We paddled through wide lakes ringed with birch and black spruce, portaged along muddy trails with the canoes balanced on our shoulders, and made camp on rocky points where you could watch the water stretch out in every direction until it blurred into the tree line. The air had that specific October quality where every breath feels clean in a way that makes you realize how stale your normal air is. Loons called across the lakes in the evening, and their voices echoed off the rock faces with a clarity that made them sound closer than they were. Shelby caught a northern pike the second evening that was big enough for all four of us. Danny made a ceremony of measuring it with his forearm and declaring it a record. Oran Shelby told him his forearms were too short to measure anything reliably. We cooked the fish over a fire, ate until we could not move, and sat watching the stars appear in a sky so dark and deep it looked like you could fall into it. Marcus pointed out constellations that I am fairly sure he was inventing. Nobody corrected him. There was a feeling settling over the group that I had almost forgotten was possible. The low-grade noise of regular life, the deadlines, the notifications, the awareness that someone always needs something from you, had gone quiet somewhere around the second portage and had not come back. By the second night, I felt lighter than I had in months. I think we all did. Danny said it felt like the first week of summer when you were a kid. That feeling of time stretching out in front of you with nothing in it but possibility. It was a good way to describe it. On the third morning, we paddled into Brule Lake. Brule is not one of the popular destinations. Marcus had built our route specifically to avoid the well-traveled corridors, and Brule was the most remote point on our loop. It took most of the morning to reach it, including a brutal half-mile portage where Danny slipped on a wet route and nearly lost the food pack into a ravine. When we finally slid the canoes into Brule, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the comfortable quiet of a place at rest, but something more total. No bird calls, no wind working through the canopy, no insect noise, just the sound of our paddles entering and leaving the water. I looked at Shelby in the bow of my canoe and saw her head tilted slightly, the way she does when she is listening hard for something that is not quite there. She glanced back at me, and I could tell she had noticed it too. The lake itself was striking. The water was so dark and still it looked like a pane of black glass, and the trees along the shoreline were reflected so perfectly you could not easily tell where the real forest ended and the image began. The sun was up and bright, but the light did not seem to penetrate the surface at all. You could put your paddle in and lose sight of the blade 6 inches below. We found the campsite around noon. There were several established sites on Brule, marked by fire grates and flat clearings where previous campers had leveled the ground. We were aiming for one on the north shore that Marcus had identified on the map. When we rounded a small wooded point and the site came into view, I saw the tent immediately. It was a good tent, a 2-person backpacking model, burnt orange, set up properly with the rainfly taut and the guy lines staked at clean angles. The zipper on the vestibule door was open, pulled all the way to the right, and the flap hung loose. From the water, you could see into the dim interior. A dark green sleeping bag rolled tight, gear arranged neatly around the edges. Marcus called out. His voice carried across the water, hit the far tree line, and came back as a faint echo. Nobody answered. We beached the canoes and walked up to the site. The gravel crunched under our boots in a way that sounded too loud against the silence. The fire grate had been cleaned, scrubbed to bare metal, with the ash removed and scattered. A bear hang rope was still slung over a high branch, suspending a single dry bag about 12 feet off the ground. The knot on the rope was a proper trucker's hitch, tied by someone who had done it hundreds of times. Everything about the campsite said that whoever set it up was experienced, methodical, and careful. There was no garbage, no scattered equipment, nothing to suggest a struggle or an emergency or even a moment of carelessness. Just an occupied site, Meticulously maintained, missing its occupant. Danny found the permit tag first. It was attached to a tree near the fire grate in a clear plastic sleeve, the way you are required to display them in the boundary waters for ranger checks. He read it aloud. Solo entry, October 2nd. Planned duration 6 days. Exit via Sawbill. It was now October 13th. Whoever this person was, they were 5 days overdue on a 6-day trip. I crouched at the tent opening and looked inside. The sleeping bag, the boots beside the sleeping pad, the dry bags organized by what appeared to be food, clothing, and cooking gear. Nothing was missing. This was not someone who had packed up their essentials and gone on a day hike. This was everything they had brought, their entire kit, left behind in careful order. Shelby found the footprints about 10 yards from the tent, leading toward the water. They were pressed into a patch of soft ground between the rocks, clear enough to see individual toes. Bare feet, walking in a direct line toward the lake. The prints reached the water line and entered the water. There were no prints coming back. We searched the immediate area for the next hour. Marcus organized it the way he organizes everything, walking the perimeter in widening arcs, checking the tree line, scanning the water from different vantage points. We called out at intervals. We looked for secondary trails, broken branches, any sign of travel in a direction that was not directly toward the lake. We found nothing. There was exactly one set of prints, heading in exactly one direction. Danny said what I think we were all considering, that the person had probably gone swimming, maybe at dusk, and maybe misjudging the water temperature and drowned. It happens more often than people realize. In October, the lake surface would have been in the low 40s. Hypothermia sets in fast. Someone disoriented by the cold could lose motor control and go under in minutes. He said we should note the permit information, paddle to the nearest exit, and report it to the ranger station. Shelby disagreed. She said we should stay nearby at least one night in case the person was alive and returned from a long hike or a fishing trip on a connected lake. We did not know for certain that the footprints were recent. Maybe the person was simply overdue and would come back with a story about getting turned around. Marcus backed her up. We compromised by setting up our camp at the next site over, about 200 yards down the shoreline. Close enough to hear if anyone returned, far enough to leave the site undisturbed in case it needed to be examined by someone official. We made camp in the early afternoon. The silence on the lake had not changed. It hung over the water like a physical thing, thick and strangely pressurized. I caught Marcus standing at the shoreline at one point, staring toward the center of the lake with his hands at his sides. When I asked what he was looking at, he paused for a long time before answering. He said the water looked like it was moving out in the middle, not waves or wind ripples, a slow circular current turning in on itself. I looked where he pointed and I could not see it. He shrugged and walked back to the fire. He did not mention it again. That night, around 2 a.m, Danny woke us up. He was crouching between our tents in the dark, and I could hear him shaking Marcus by the shoulder through the thin tent wall. His voice had a quality to it I had never heard from him before, not in 15 years of friendship. Danny is the person in our group who deflects everything with humor. He is the one who makes things smaller and safer by refusing to take them seriously. But the voice outside my tent was not doing that. He was not panicking either. He sounded confused in a deep, structural way, like a person who has just been told something that rearranges the order of things they thought they understood. He told us to be quiet and listen. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly, trying not to make noise, though I could not have said what I was afraid of alerting. I lay still. It took a few seconds to hear anything because my heartbeat was so loud in my own ears that it drowned out the smaller sounds. Then my pulse settled, and the night opened up, and I heard it. Splashing. From the lake. Rhythmic, measured, steady splashing. Not the frantic, uneven sound of someone in distress. This was controlled. Repetitive. It had the patience and cadence of routine, like someone swimming long, even strokes from one point to another and back again. Someone who had swum the same stretch so many times, their body no longer needed to think about the mechanics of the movement. Back and forth, unhurried. The four of us stood at the shoreline with our headlamps aimed across the water. The beams reached maybe 40 or 50 feet before the darkness swallowed them. The surface was flat and black and completely empty as far as we could see. But the splashing continued. It was coming from further out, past the reach of our lights, and it did not react to our presence in any way. It did not speed up when we turned on the lamps. It did not stop when Marcus called out across the water. It simply continued at the same pace, the same rhythm, as though we were not there at all. We stood for nearly 20 minutes, listening. Danny kept adjusting the angle of his flashlight, sweeping it in slow arcs, trying to catch a shape, a ripple, anything on the surface that corresponded to the sound. Shelby held her beam steady on one spot and watched for disturbances in the reflection. Marcus had stopped using his light entirely and was just staring into the dark, head tilted, trying to triangulate the direction. There was nothing visible, no wake, no silhouette, no interruption in the glassy surface. The sound existed entirely without a source. It was coming from the water, the way that cold comes from ice, not from any single point, but from the whole of it. Then it stopped. Not a gradual fade. It simply ceased, mid-stroke, the way a recording stops when you press a button. One stroke, then silence, then nothing at all. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, because the sound had at least been something to focus on, something to point your light toward and try to explain. The silence was just us, 4 people standing in a line at the edge of a black lake in the middle of an October night in a place where nobody could hear us and nobody knew exactly where we were. The water lay in front of us like a dark mirror that reflected nothing. Marcus was the first to speak. He said we should go back to the tents. He said it in the voice he uses when he has made a decision and does not want to discuss it, and none of us argued. We walked back to camp in single file without turning off our headlamps. Nobody slept well after that. I lay in my bag with my eyes open until gray light appeared at the edges of the tent fly, listening for the splashing to return. It did not. But the silence felt different now. It felt like the silence of something that was choosing not to make noise, rather than the silence of nothing being there. In the morning, Shelby found the footprints. She came back from a walk to the original campsite with a look on her face that I recognized immediately because I had seen it once before, years ago, when she got rear-ended at a stoplight and walked away from the car in a daze. It was the look of someone whose understanding of what is possible has just been revised without their consent. The prints were at the waterline near the abandoned tent, and they were fresh. The mud was still dark and wet in the impressions. Bare feet, the same approximate size as the prints leading into the water the day before. But these came the other direction, out of the lake, up the shore. They led in a straight line to the open tent, where they stopped in front of the vestibule. You could see where the person had stood for some time. The impressions were deeper there, pressed down by weight that shifted slightly forward and back, the way someone shifts when they are standing and looking at something they are not sure they want to touch. Then the prince led back to the water, into the lake, gone. Not the frantic, uneven sound of someone in distress. This was controlled, repetitive. It had the patience and cadence of routine, like someone swimming long. Even strokes from one point to another and back again. Someone who had swum the same stretch so many times their body no longer needed to think about the mechanics of the movement. Back and forth, unhurried. The four of us stood at the shoreline with our headlamps aimed across the water. The beams reached maybe 40 or 50 feet before the darkness swallowed them. The surface was flat and black and completely empty as far as we could see. But the splashing continued. It was coming from further out, past the reach of our lights, and it did not react to our presence in any way. It did not speed up when we turned on the lamps. It did not stop when Marcus called out across the water. It simply continued at the same pace, the same rhythm, as though we were not there at all. We stood for nearly 20 minutes listening, and Danny kept adjusting the angle of his flashlight, sweeping it in slow arcs, trying to catch a shape, a ripple, anything on the surface that corresponded to the sound. Shelby held her beam steady on one spot and watched for disturbances in the reflection. Marcus had stopped using his light entirely and was just staring into the dark, head tilted, trying to triangulate the direction. There was nothing visible, no wake, no silhouette, no interruption in the glassy surface. The sound existed entirely without a source. It was coming from the water the way that cold comes from ice, not from any single point, but from the whole of it. Then it stopped. Not a gradual fade. It simply ceased, mid-stroke, the way a recording stops when you press a button. One stroke, then silence, then nothing at all. And the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, because the sound had at least been something to focus on, something to point your light toward and try to explain. The silence was just us, 4 people standing in a line at the edge of a black lake in the middle of a October night, in a place where nobody could hear us, and nobody knew exactly where we were. The water lay in front of us like a dark mirror that reflected nothing. Marcus was the first to speak. He said we should go back to the tents. He said it in the voice he uses when he has made a decision and does not want to discuss it, and none of us argued. We walked back to camp in single file without turning off our headlamps. Nobody slept well after that. I lay in my bag with my eyes open until gray light appeared at the edges of the tent fly, all listening for the splashing to return. It did not. But the silence felt different now. It felt like the silence of something that was choosing not to make noise, rather than the silence of nothing being there. In the morning, Shelby found the footprints. She came back from a walk to the original campsite with a look on her face that I recognized immediately because I had seen it once before, years ago, when she got rear-ended at a stoplight and walked away from the car in a daze. It was the look of someone whose understanding of what is possible has just been revised without their consent. The prints were at the waterline near the abandoned tent. They were fresh. The mud was still dark and wet in the impressions. Bare feet, the same approximate size as the prints leading into the water the day before. But these came the other direction. Out of the lake, up the shore. They led in a straight line to the open tent, where they stopped in front of the vestibule. You could see where the person had stood for some time. The impressions were deeper there, pressed down by weight that shifted slightly forward and back, the way someone shifts when they are standing and looking at something they are not sure they want to touch. Then the prince led back to the water, into the lake. Gone. Whoever had walked into Brule Lake had come back out in the middle of the night, walked to the tent, stood in front of their packed belongings for a while, and then returned to the water. I watched Danny's face while Shelby explained what she had found. His expression moved through something I can only describe as a series of locked doors opening one after another, each one leading somewhere he did not want to go. He did not make a joke. He did not offer a rational explanation. He just stood there for a long time and then sat down on a rock and looked at his hands. Marcus made a decision that, at the time, felt like the right one. He said before we left, we should check the other campsites on the lake. Not to search for the person. He had moved past that, but to see if there was anything else we were missing. Any context that might make what we had found less impossible. He divided us into two groups. Danny and I would paddle counterclockwise along the western shore. He and Shelby would go clockwise. We would meet on the far side. Danny and I paddled for about 40 minutes along the shoreline, checking each established campsite we passed. Most were empty and had been for some time. Cold fire grates, bare tent pads, nothing unusual. Then we rounded a narrow, overgrown point and found a campsite that was not on our map. There was a tent, or what remained of one. The fabric had weathered badly, faded from what might have been blue to a pale bleached gray. The rainfly was partially collapsed under a layer of pine needles and rotting leaves. But the structure was still recognizable, and the vestibule zipper was open. From the inside, I pulled back the fly and looked in. A sleeping bag, compressed and water-stained but still rolled, a dry bag with a cracked buckle, a pair of hiking boots placed beside the sleeping pad. The same arrangement, the same careful order, the same quiet sense of someone who had taken the time to put everything in its place before walking away. Danny found the permit tag. It was barely legible. The ink faded and the plastic sleeve yellowed with age, but you could make out the year. 3 years ago. Different name. Solo entry. Same entry point. Same overdue pattern. We did not say much to each other on the paddle to the meeting point. When we found Marcus and Shelby already on shore on the eastern side, Shelby's expression told me everything before either of them spoke. They had found 2 more. One tent was roughly 5 years old, are based on the condition and the permit date. It was set back further from the water than the others, tucked into a stand of young spruce, as though the person who pitched it had wanted privacy even from the lake. The other was older than that. The fabric so deteriorated it was mostly just a frame of aluminum poles, with shreds of nylon hanging from the joints like dead skin. A small birch tree had started growing through one corner of the floor, its white trunk pushing up through the fabric with the slow patience of something that knows it has all the time it needs. But inside each one, the gear was still there. Sleeping bags, boots, packed dry bags, all of it arranged with the same methodical care, the same deliberate organization. As if every one of these people, separated by years and unknown to each other, yet had followed the same quiet procedure before they left. 5 tents, 5 solo travelers, spanning at least 7 years, all on the same lake, all with the zipper opened from the inside, all with every piece of gear still packed, all with boots left behind, as though the person who owned them would not be needing them where they were going. Shelby spoke first. She said this was not an accident. One drowning is a tragedy. 5 solo travelers disappearing from the same lake across 7 years, all leaving their gear in the same deliberate arrangement, is something else. Something that does not fit inside the explanations we are comfortable with. Marcus said we were leaving. Not tomorrow morning. Now. It was mid-afternoon, and we had enough daylight for one lake of paddling, enough to put distance between us and Brule before dark. We could camp on the next lake and push hard for the exit in the morning. Nobody argued. We started packing. That is when I should have been finished with Brule Lake. We should have paddled away and spent the rest of our lives telling the story at dinner parties as a strange thing that happened once on a canoe trip, growing less certain of the details each year until it softened into something that might have been exaggerated, might have been misremembered, might have been nothing at all. But while Marcus, Shelby, and Danny were breaking down camp and loading the canoes, I walked back to the original tent one last time, the orange one. I stood where the footprints had been that morning and looked at the boots inside. I do not know what I was hoping to find. Something that would make the neatness make sense. Some small detail I had missed that would rearrange the whole picture into something I could live with. I heard Danny calling my name from the shore. I turned to go, and I looked at the lake. There was someone standing in the water. They were about 30 yards from shore, in water up to their knees, facing away from me, toward the center of the lake, not moving, just standing there in the dark water, with the afternoon light falling across the surface around them. I could see enough to know it was a person. The shape of shoulders, the angle of a head tilted slightly downward, the slight sway of someone standing in a gentle current that I could not otherwise detect. They were barefoot. The water was shallow enough near shore that I could see their feet on the rocky bottom, pale against dark stone. I did not call out. I did not move. I stood at the edge of the campsite and watched the way you watch something that you know. On a level beneath language, you are not supposed to interrupt. The person began to walk, deeper, slowly, at the pace of someone wading into a lake they have known for a very long time. Each step was placed with a kind of familiarity, a certainty about the bottom that you only get from repetition. The water rose past their thighs, past their waist, past their chest. They did not turn around. They did not hesitate. The water reached their shoulders and they kept walking at exactly the same pace. It covered the back of their head. The surface rippled once, gently, and then it was still. I waited for them to come back up. I stood there and I waited for the gasp, the splash, the thrashing, any of the sounds a person makes when water fills their lungs and their body fights to survive. There was nothing. No sound at all. The lake absorbed them completely and without effort, the way a conversation absorbs a pause. The water settled back into that black glass stillness, and I was standing alone on the shore of a campsite where someone had packed their things and placed their boots and opened the zipper from the inside and walked away from everything they owned. I should have shouted. I should have run into the water. I should have done any of the things you are supposed to do when you watch someone go under. But I did not. And the reason I did not is the part that I have spent the most time trying to understand. It was not shock. It was not fear. It was recognition. Something in the way they walked, the calm, the certainty, the way they never once turned around, told me that this was not a person who needed saving. This was a person who had arrived. Danny was beside me a moment later. He had come up the trail when I did not answer his calls. He asked me what I was looking at. I told him nothing. I told him I was just taking a last look at the campsite. We walked to the canoes together, and we paddled out of Brule Lake with the afternoon light going gold on the water behind us, and I did not tell any of them what I had seen. Not then. Not for a long time. We made the exit 2 days later. We were efficient and quiet in a way that felt different from the easy rhythm of the trip's first days. Nobody joked during portages. Nobody lingered at campsites. We paddled, we carried, we set up and broke down camp with the minimum necessary conversation. When we pulled the canoes out at the Sawbill Landing on the morning of the 5th day, Marcus walked directly to the ranger station to file a report. I was standing by the truck when he came back. His face had a look on it that I did not immediately recognize. It was not shock. It was not fear. It was something flatter and more permanent, like the expression of someone who has just learned that a question they assumed had an answer does not. He told me the ranger had listened to every detail, wrote it all down, asked about the permit tags, the dates, the condition of the tents, professional and thorough, and then the ranger had asked one question that Marcus could not stop repeating. Which tent did you find first? Not, you found a tent. Not surprise, not confusion, not disbelief. Which one? As though there were several possibilities, and the only relevant question was which one we had come across. Marcus had pressed him. The ranger explained carefully and without emotion that solo travelers had been reported overdue from Brule Lake intermittently for years. Search and rescue teams had gone in. They found tents, cataloged gear, searched the shoreline, dragged sections of the lake with sonar. No bodies were ever recovered. The lake was 42 feet at its deepest point, with a rocky bottom and reasonable visibility in warmer months. There was nothing down there. No remains, no submerged equipment, no explanation. Marcus asked why the lake was still open, why there were no warnings posted, no restrictions on solo permits for that area. The ranger said there was no legal basis for closing it, no evidence of foul play, no identifiable environmental hazard, no toxicology in the water, no unusual geological features, no history of animal attacks, no policy that covered what was happening, because what was happening did not fit into any category the Forest Service maintained a policy for. You cannot close a lake because people go there alone and decide not to come back. That is not a hazard. That is a choice. Marcus asked about the tents, why they were still out there if search teams had investigated. The ranger said they were not. Search teams removed the tents every time, along with all the gear. They cataloged it, photographed it, stored it as evidence in missing persons cases that never closed and never progressed. The tents we found were new ones, set up after the last removal, placed, organized, and stocked by someone. By the same people, the ranger implied, though he did not say that directly. He did not have to. We drove home the next day. 12 hours in Marcus's truck. I think we talked about Brule Lake for maybe 20 minutes of that drive. There was no framework for what we had found that made conversation productive. Danny made one attempt to rationalize it as a local legend that had been built up from coincidences and confirmation bias. Shelby told him to stop, not with anger, but with a tiredness that ended the discussion completely. I have spoken to Shelby about it once since then, on the phone, about 6 months after the trip. She asked me directly whether I had noticed anything that last afternoon that I had not shared with the group. I told her no. I do not know why I lied. And maybe because saying what I saw out loud would have moved it from a room in my mind where I could control when I visited it into the open air, where it would be permanent and unavoidable and real in a way I was not ready for. What I think about most is not the figure in the water. It is not the splashing at night, or the 5 tents, or the ranger's unsurprised voice. It is the footprints that came out of the lake in the morning, walked to the tent, and went back. Because that means whoever they were, wherever they went when the water closed over their heads, they came back. Not to leave, not to escape. They came back to check on the things they had left behind. The sleeping bag they had rolled so carefully, the boots they had placed just right, and they stood at the open door of a life they had packed up and organized and chosen to walk away from, and they looked at it. And then they turned around and went back into the water. I do not know what is in Brule Lake. I do not know what those people found, or what they heard, or what called to them strongly enough that they set their boots down and walked barefoot into water cold enough to stop a heart. But I know they did not leave in panic. They left the way you leave a house you love when you have finally accepted that you belong somewhere else. They folded everything. They placed their boots by the door. They took one last look. And some nights, when the house is quiet and I am very still, I understand something about it. Not the answer. Just the shape of the question they were asking when they stepped off the bottom and let the dark water take them somewhere I cannot follow. That is what frightens me. Not that something is in that lake. That whatever it is made the leaving look so gentle. Remember, some places don't want you to leave. Thanks for watching the video.